My son gave me an ultimatum. Either bow to his wife or leave this house. I smiled quietly, picked up my suitcase, and walked out of the very home I had built with my own hands. No argument, no complaint, I simply chose peace. 3 days later, the phone wouldn't stop ringing, 17 missed calls. But this time, I felt no need to answer. My name is Walter Grayson. And from wherever you're watching this, stay with me. Have you ever given everything to your family, only to realize they no longer want you in it? The cold morning air bit into my skin as I stood outside, watching the house I'd nurtured for decades shrink behind me. The street hummed with life, neighbors greeting each other, children playing. But none of it felt familiar anymore. The hardwood floors that echoed with laughter were now just a memory trapped behind locked doors. I traced the worn handle of my suitcase, feeling the weight of years spent building a legacy slowly unravel. There was no anger in my chest, only a quiet ache, a hollow that no apology could fill. I wasn't walking away in defeat. No, I was stepping into a silence that I'd earned. The world outside my old front door was harsh but honest. And sometimes, peace means letting go of the fight you thought you had to win. The phone's relentless buzzing was a ghost, reminding me that some connections fray beyond repair. The house wasn't mine anymore, not the way I knew it. That night, I slept under the cold stars, knowing that the hardest battles are fought in silence, and the loudest victories come from walking away. The road out of town was empty except for the hum of my old sedan's engine and the steady rhythm of my thoughts. The city skyline disappeared behind me like a fading photograph, sharp edges blurring into nothingness. I wasn't running. I was retreating into the only space where I could breathe without the weight of broken promises crushing my chest. I found a small motel on the outskirts, the kind of place where the walls hold 1,000 forgotten stories. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and distant regret. I laid my suitcase down, but the heaviness didn't lift. It pressed harder, like the echo of my son's ultimatum bouncing inside my skull. The phone kept ringing off the hook, calls from numbers I recognized, calls I chose to ignore. There was no "Dad, no, please come back." Just desperation wrapped in silence. The woman I raised my son with, once warm and inviting, had vanished behind a veil of control. Her kingdom had been built on my absence. At night, I stared at the cracked ceiling, memories slipping through the cracks like sand. The laughter of my grandchildren, the warmth of family dinners, the dreams I once held, all distant now, like a life lived by someone else. I lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward like my fading hope. I realized peace wasn't something given, it was something taken, stolen back piece by piece. And I was just beginning. Tomorrow, I'd face the fallout. But tonight, I was still the man who had built a home, even if that home no longer wanted me. The morning light crept through the threadbare curtains, casting long shadows on the cracked motel walls. My phone buzzed again, another missed call. 17 by now. I didn't answer. Each ring felt like a thread pulling me back into a web I'd been desperate to escape. But I was no longer the man who needed their approval. In the silence, I found clarity. I wasn't just a guest in their lives. I was a forgotten foundation, the roots they tried to sever without knowing the damage they'd cause. The first call was from my son. His voice was tight, polite but distant. "Dad, we miss you. Please come home." But it was the voice of someone reading lines he didn't believe. The next calls came in waves. My daughter, my ex-wife, even a neighbor. They wanted to patch things up, but the damage wasn't in words. It was in years of being unseen. I sat outside the motel, cigarette burning between my fingers, the bitter taste sharper than ever. I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made, the late nights working 2 jobs, the birthdays missed, the silent nights I endured so they could have more. And now, I was an option, a burden, a ghost in the house I built. But peace wasn't found in their calls. It was in my refusal to return to a place where I was unwelcome. That day I made a choice, not just to walk away, but to reclaim the story that had been written without me. The phone kept ringing, but I finally let it ring out, unanswered, like a door closing behind a man who was done knocking. 3 days passed in a fog of silence, broken only by the relentless ringing of a phone I refused to answer. Then, unexpectedly, a letter arrived, carefully folded, sealed with a faint smudge of my son's fingerprints. His handwriting was familiar but shaky, each stroke revealing the weight of regret and hope intertwined. "Dad, we never meant to push you away. Things got complicated between us. Your place is here always. Please come back. We miss you more than words can say." I held the letter close, the paper crinkling under my fingers, as if it carried the fragile remnants of a family I once knew. The words promised reconciliation, but beneath them lay the echo of years spent in silence, of sacrifices unnoticed, and affection taken for granted. The house I'd built with my own hands now seemed like a ghost town, its walls whispering memories that no longer felt mine. No laughter echoed through the halls. No footsteps pattered by the fireplace. Just cold emptiness, waiting patiently for me to return or to let it crumble. Outside the motel window, the city pulsed with life. Cars honked, strangers hurried by, and somewhere distant, children's laughter carried on the wind. But inside me, a battle raged between longing and pride. I poured a glass of whiskey, its amber glow catching the fading sunlight. The first sip burned my throat, a bitter reminder of all the times I swallowed pride to keep peace within a family fracturing beneath the weight of unspoken words. Yet peace wasn't found in empty apologies or in letters drenched with longing. Peace was a fragile treasure I needed to claim for myself, away from the echoes of broken promises and faded love. With a steady hand, I sat at the motel desk and penned my reply. No desperate pleas. No promises to return. Just a quiet declaration of self-respect and resolve. Thank you for your words. But peace is something I must find on my own terms. I hope someday we all find it. I sealed the envelope with a final breath, a goodbye that carried more strength than any shouted argument. Days bled into a week. The phone stopped ringing. The silence was deafening. At first I craved the noise, the desperate calls, the apologies, the voices I used to know. But then, that silence became a sanctuary. It was as if the world itself held its breath, waiting to see if I would return or disappear forever. I spent long afternoons sitting on the motel's worn porch, watching life carry on without me. Strangers passed by, heads down, lost in their own struggles. I realized then that my absence was a quiet rebellion, a protest against a family that had traded respect for convenience. The weight of the house I'd left behind settled like a stone in my gut. That place wasn't just wood and nails. It was the backdrop of every milestone, every birthday, every tear and triumph. And yet, they had turned it into a fortress that barred me out. One evening, under a sky heavy with clouds, I lit a cigarette and let the smoke curl around me like a shield. The bitter taste reminded me of every compromise I'd swallowed, every time I'd silenced my own voice for the sake of peace. But peace, I learned, wasn't silence. It was standing firm when everything around you tries to break you down. I thought about my son's ultimatum, the sharp edge of his wife's cold eyes, the quiet exclusion I'd endured. They wanted me gone, but I wasn't defeated. I was free. The silence was no longer empty. It was mine. That night, I closed my eyes and made a promise to myself, to build a new life on my terms. No longer a ghost in someone else's house, but the architect of my own future. Tomorrow, I would start taking those first steps. The dawn was quiet but promising as I stepped outside the motel and breathed in the cool morning air. No longer weighed down by the past, I felt something I hadn't in years. Possibility. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it was mine to choose. I checked my phone one last time. No missed calls, no messages. The silence was no longer a void, but a space to fill with new memories, new dreams. I felt lighter, as if shedding a skin too tight for too long. I found a small town nearby, where people greeted each other with smiles and stories. I rented a modest apartment, the kind with creaky floors and cheap rent, but it was mine. Every step I took within those four walls was a step toward reclaiming myself. I visited a local cafe where the barista learned my name in a day, I started walking in the park each morning, the rhythm of my footsteps matching the steady beat of a heart learning to heal. With every sunrise, I wrote in my journal, thoughts, regrets, hopes, all pouring out like a river, finally allowed to run free. Money was tight, but freedom was priceless. I cashed in some savings, not for luxury, but to buy time, to rebuild not just my life, but my sense of worth. I wasn't just an old man who left his family behind. I was a man discovering who he was without their shadows. One evening, a neighbor knocked and introduced herself, Maggie, a widow with stories and scars of her own. We shared coffee and quiet laughter, two souls carving space in a world that had tried to erase them. For the first time in decades, I felt seen, not by blood, but by choice. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But as the city lights blinked on outside my window, I realized this was no longer an ending. It was a beginning. Months slipped by like pages turning in a long-forgotten book. I stayed steady, planting roots where no one expected me to flourish. The silence from my old life remained, no calls, no letters. But that emptiness no longer haunted me. Instead, it was a quiet anthem of survival. One afternoon, I found myself at the local library, flipping through a newspaper with a headline I never thought I'd see. Son's business faces bankruptcy after family fallout. The story detailed a series of failed ventures, mounting debts, and the collapse of a company once praised as a rising star. The son I once adored had built his empire on shaky ground, perhaps crumbling under the weight of his own choices. I felt no glee, no triumph, just a deep, solemn understanding. Life has a way of balancing its scales, often when we least expect it. The house I'd left behind might have felt like a loss, but in truth, I was spared a different kind of ruin. That evening, I sat on my porch, the cool breeze carrying memories and regrets. I wasn't the man who bowed to ultimatums anymore. I was the man who chose peace, who reclaimed his dignity without shouting or violence. I pulled out my journal and wrote one final entry for that chapter. Sometimes, walking away is the strongest fight you'll ever win. Not with fists, but with your soul. A soft knock came at the door. Maggie stood there, holding 2 cups of coffee and a smile that felt like home. In that moment, I realized my greatest victory wasn't in their fall, it was in my rise. The phone stayed silent, but my heart was loud and clear. I had won. The years had passed, but the wounds had healed, not by forgetting, but by forgiving myself. I never sought revenge in the way the world expects. No harsh words, no public confrontations, no drama to feed gossip. My justice was quieter, deeper, and infinitely more satisfying. One afternoon, I received a letter, not from my son or wife, but from a lawyer. It was brief, factual. The company my son had built was declared bankrupt. Creditors were closing in, lawsuits mounting. The empire that had once seemed untouchable was crumbling like brittle glass. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. I felt no satisfaction in their misfortune, only a profound peace in knowing life had balanced itself. I had been cast out, but I had rebuilt. They had lost a father, but I had found myself. At the little apartment that had become my sanctuary, Maggie and I sat by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky burned with streaks of orange and purple, a reminder that even after the darkest days, light returns. "Do you ever think about going back?" she asked softly. I shook my head, a gentle smile touching my lips. No. I learned that some places are meant to stay behind us. My home isn't a house anymore. It's wherever I'm respected, where I'm seen. My phone remained silent, but that silence no longer stung. It was a shield, a testament to a battle won without a single harsh word. I was more than a man who walked away. I was a man who chose himself, who found peace in solitude, and who lived to tell the story of quiet justice. Because sometimes the loudest victory is the one no one sees.